You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 104. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers. Are you a wholehearted disciple?
Well, what's a wholehearted disciple?
Tim, why are you answering a question with a question?
Why are you? You're doing the same.
We're going to answer all of those questions on today's episode.
If you want to learn your next step to grow as a follower of Jesus, take the Seasons of Following Jesus quiz. You'll identify what season you're living in and unlock your next steps to deepen your relationship with Jesus. You can take the 5-question 2-minute quiz at transformingmission.org/quiz. If you haven't already done so, hit subscribe where you're listening to this episode. You never know when we might drop another bonus episode. Now, Sarah, you asked if we were wholehearted disciples to start us off.
I did. So when I talk about a wholehearted disciple, and this is a working definition, here's what I'm talking about. A wholehearted disciple is a person on a journey to cultivate courage, compassion, and connection with Jesus Christ, your local congregation, and the local community.
Okay, I think we're going to have to slow down a minute and unpack some of this. So what are we talking about?
Let me begin by saying this. When we hear the word wholehearted, I think one of two things can happen. You either say whole what? Or wholehearted, yeah, I'm all in. In other words, you have all of me. But the reality is it's not that simple. So if you're thinking, does that make me a half-hearted disciple? No, that's not what we're talking about here, because I don't know what a half-hearted disciple is or what a half-hearted disciple looks like. I think the question is that we're getting at when we ask, are you a wholehearted disciple, is, are you on a journey with Jesus? Are you all in with Jesus?
Even if you don't know what all in means when it comes to your relationship with Jesus?
Yeah. So, Tim, you invited people to take a quiz to determine their what we're calling your season of following Jesus. We call them seasons because we cycle through them over and over and over again. So someone who is just stepping into a relationship with Jesus and finds themselves in the early season, the explore season, they're learning who Jesus is and they're learning who they are in Christ. At that point, you don't know the fullness of who God has created you to be. Tim, you've been at this your entire life, and you would probably say, I still don't have the fullness, because once you think you do, you start all over. And so again, that's why we're calling these seasons. So someone who returns to the explore season after leading, let's say, a team for 6 months is going to be looking to refine their understanding of who Jesus is and who they are. The same is true of being a disciple, and a wholehearted disciple is no different.
So if you're a disciple, why do we need to be wholehearted disciples?
You don't.
Then why are we talking about it?
That's a really good question and a logical one. You don't need to be a wholehearted disciple, but here's why I believe we need to invest in becoming wholehearted disciples. As I reflect on the people that we lead, the people in our communities, and people all around the world, there's a human problem that we're facing. We're disconnected, we're increasingly discouraged, and dare I say, cynical. And I'm willing to go out on a very strong limb and say that there are two things we need to address the problem. First, we need to have Jesus as our foundation. You might say we need to have Jesus as our light or our hope. However you want to say it, I don't care. Jesus needs to be at the center of your life. And that involves a relationship. That involves being a disciple. Second, we need to cultivate courage and its sisters, compassion and connection.
So, Sarah, I'm putting myself in the place of our listeners. That sounds like a pretty tall order.
Maybe, but that's really where I think of what Paul writes to the Philippians. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And hear me, I'm not saying that the church is the answer to every single ill that we have in our world. But when I think about the concept, the idea, the big picture of being a wholehearted disciple, I think about what might be possible if we start stepping into taking the steps to live in such a way that not only are we following Jesus, but we're following Jesus with courage, with compassion, and we're seeking to deepen those connections. And I think Paul said it pretty well. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.
May I say that again? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Paul knew how to step into challenges.
I'll be really honest. There are days that I've thought, forget it. Why not just show up at church on Sunday morning for 1 hour and say, I'm a Christian, and then go about my merry life? Why not live that way? There's plenty of people that I know who do. But for me, the love of God that I know in Jesus continues to call me back again and again and again, as if to say, Sarah, you've learned something about my people. You've learned something about who I am. So who do you think you are to keep it to yourself? And then under my breath, I'm muttering, God, it's hard sometimes. And then if I really want to play this all out, it's, Jesus is sitting there going, yeah, sure, Sarah, I understand. As hard as the wood on the cross. And then I just throw up my hands and go, okay, fine. How many times are you going to make that point, Jesus? And it's as if God's saying, well, as many times as it takes. I'm going to sit here with you. I'm going to be present with you in the midst of this. And then I say, okay, Jesus, fine. And that's not an ambivalent fine. It's, I get it. I'm here. You're calling me to lead people. You've given me certain opportunities, and I need to be faithful to that. What's the next way to help people embrace this journey of wholehearted discipleship? So that's what runs through my mind and why we're really talking about this today. And now you know a little bit about how my conversations with Jesus go too.
Well, you've got me thinking about some of those things too. I just remember a time I was sitting in the sanctuary. I can go through the whole story, but I'm sitting alone in the sanctuary, and I imagine Jesus on the cross, and he steps off the cross and walks down towards me. And when he gets up close to me, he says, "What can I do for you?" And I said, I'm really tired. I don't want to do this anymore. I gave my life to you. I've been following you. And it doesn't get any easier. My kids have to change schools. My wife she gets tenure teaching, and then all of a sudden we have to move. We're doing something else. And Jesus says, okay, follow me.
Right.
And I say, well, how much more do you want? And he turns around, climbs back up on the cross, stretches out his arms and says, come on. When I hear Paul say, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, it's not easy. It's as hard as the wood on the cross. But that's what I'm hearing you say. That's the journey we're on toward wholehearted discipleship. Did I get it?
Yeah, and I think the other piece of what I hear you saying, Tim, is that it may be hard, but we are never alone in this. Jesus is always with us. And so it's not that we're inviting you to do something that's hard just for the sake of doing something hard. No, that is because I don't think that's who Jesus is, and I don't think that that's how the love of God gets expressed. What we're offering is that, yeah, there are going to be times that it's hard. And yeah, what we're talking about today may feel like a tall order. But what I've learned is that a life with Jesus, it's countercultural. It is not what you will hear, what you will see, what most people will be doing. The other thing that I've learned is courage and compassion and connection are also countercultural. And none of those things are easy, but they're all worth it.
So, Sarah, let's walk through courage, compassion, and connection. Would you lead us?
Sure. And we're going to give you an example from our relationships with Jesus, our congregations, and the local community as we walk through this as well.
So before we dive into that, let me remind you that you can download a one-page transformation guide. It'll help you explore courage, compassion, and connection with Christ, the congregation, and the community. You can find that at transformingmission.org/104. Now, we've mentioned this before, but the Latin root of courage is cor. It means heart. Courage is used to mean speak one's mind by telling one's heart. That's where at the heart of courage. Speak one's mind by telling one's heart. So when we talk about wholehearted disciples, we're talking about a Jesus follower with courage, a Jesus follower who is someone who's willing to put their vulnerability on the line.
And I would say don't move on too quickly, because when we're talking about courage, we're not talking about being a superhero. We're talking about the ordinary courage, how Tim just said it, as someone who is willing to put their vulnerability on the line. We're not asking you to get naked, folks. That's not what vulnerability is about either. If you go back to some of our previous episodes, we talk about that in depth, but it's that feeling that we get when we're feeling emotionally exposed. So maybe this example will help to illustrate what we mean by vulnerability. I know a manager at a tech company who leads a team in training and development, and he shared something last week, and this is what he said. He said, "I recognized the arena. I saw how I could step up with vulnerability, and I didn't. I'm committed to doing better." I love what he said because he didn't get it right.
He didn't get it right. But what I just heard you say is he was willing to try again. And that's not only vulnerability, but that's also learning to rise. And as we've talked about it, he's writing a new ending to that story.
Absolutely. And how often do we recognize what we haven't done and don't even attempt to try it again?
Right.
We beat ourselves. We end up beating ourselves up because we didn't do something. And so in the midst of beating ourselves up, we don't even try to step into the arena again. We just back off and say, okay, not going to do that. Sorry.
Yeah, we failed. We give up before we've even really tried.
Yeah. And so what I heard in his statement was he had the courage to stink at something new. He didn't have to have it all together. That's modeling vulnerability and saying, you know what, we're going to try this and we're not going to get it right, but we're going to come back again. And the next time we come back, we're going to get it. We're going to be just a little bit better. We're going to learn something the next time.
So what I've been learning from you, Sarah, is that him stepping into it with his vulnerability, you've helped me understand that courage is a set of 4 teachable, measurable, observable skills. And we've mentioned 2 of them: rumbling with vulnerability, what we were just talking, and I threw in learning to rise. So what about braving trust and living our values? Where do they fit in?
Yeah, those absolutely play into cultivating courage in our relationship with Jesus and our congregations and our communities. For today, I'll simply leave it like this. Your values can guide you in everything from how you spend your time to decision making to where you invest and spend your money in your relationship with Jesus, with your congregation, and your community. So hear what I'm saying there. Your values and living into your values are going to guide everything that you do, but first you need to know what they are. Second, in terms of braving trust, that's going to help fuel relationships. And remember, both trust and vulnerability are 2 sides of the same coin. You need both, and they can't be separated. We'll talk more about that when we get to connection.
Well, it's likely one of those environments or relationships is easier to say yes to than the other.
Yeah, so you're not going to step into this journey of wholehearted discipleship, tackling your relationship with Jesus, with your congregation and your community all at the same time. So what I would encourage you to do is ask yourself, what's one step that I can take? Take our example of the tech employee who recognized an opportunity. He recognized it this time. The next time he recognizes it, he's more likely to step into it because this time he recognized it.
So the second attribute of wholehearted disciple is compassion.
Yes, if you're wholehearted, with an emphasis there on hearted, compassion needs to be there.
Let's do another little Latin lesson.
I feel like I'm in school today.
Compassion comes from paticum, meaning to suffer with. So cultivating compassion with Jesus, your congregation, and the community, is this about anything goes? Bleeding hearts all over the place?
I'm going to answer that with just one word. No.
Well, good. I'm glad that's the case. So what is it about?
Well, compassion's really about our shared humanity and I would say our divinity.
So if we're going to cultivate compassion with Jesus, our congregation community, then what does it look like?
I would say it looks like two people who are in a relationship who see themselves as equals. Does that make sense?
So it's both the question of how accepting are you of yourself and of others.
Pema Chodron writes, compassion becomes real when we recognize our shared humanity. Compassion becomes real when we recognize our shared humanity. I think there's a place in compassion for generosity. And what I mean is, are you interpreting others' actions with the most generous interpretation that you can make? Do you see someone first as a human being, as another person? And when they're irritating you because they have to be right, are you getting curious about why they need to be right? And are you getting curious about why it's bugging you instead of judging that person or even blaming that person? What's the quote-unquote suffering with that needs to happen in that situation so that you can see someone else for who they are and who God created them to be, not for the irritation that they're causing in your life right now?
Sarah, you've just given us a whole podcast right there, but I'm going to jump off right here. None of us like to suffer.
And what I would say to that is, who said this was about liking anything? Last week in a workshop, I handed out cards that reminded a group of pastors and church leaders that you can't get to courage without rumbling with vulnerability. And under that, in gold foil printed letters, it said, embrace the suck.
Sometime we'll need to tell the story behind that. But let's go back to your example about people needing to be right. Actually, I'll offer a little different example. So if I ask someone to do something, or you ask them to do something and they don't do it, what does compassion within my congregation and community look like at that point?
Do you realize that you're leaving Jesus out?
No, I just think the compassion Jesus offers us is more than I can ever offer others.
And that's why I bring it up. We learn from Jesus what compassion is all about. And if Jesus didn't teach us about how to suffer with, who could? But I know that wasn't your point. You're getting at boundaries and accountability, aren't you?
Yes, and if we're cultivating compassion with Jesus, our congregation and community, that all sounds wonderful, but does accountability fly out the window?
Okay, I answered the last question like this with a simple one word. Now I'm going to say, hear me loud and clear. No. No. And I say that because the most loving thing, the most compassionate thing that any of us can do as leaders is to offer boundaries around what's okay and what's not okay and hold people accountable to it. It's okay. Here's an example. It's okay to take a small group to serve in the community where your son's Boy Scout troop may have served. It's not okay for your small group to say that that same place that you went to serve is a ministry of the whole church. If you want to make that happen, we have a process for recognizing ministry partners, and it can be found in the church office or on the website.
Okay, clear is kind and unclear is unkind.
Thank you, Brene Brown.
I like what you're saying, but let's move on. The final attribute of wholehearted disciple is connection. And what we really mean by connection is relationship.
What I tell everyone when we're talking about connection is literally, as human beings, our brains are hardwired for relationship. When we are in relationship with other people, our brains release chemicals, good chemicals in our brain that help us to continue being healthy and to thrive as human beings. And so in a very literal way, we feed off of relationships and need relationships with one another in order to thrive. And
so in a world of increasing disconnection, it's even more important that we have those relationships.
Absolutely. And I'm not speaking just of relationships online. I'm speaking of relationships with people in real life. So for this one, think about the people with whom when you are with them, you feel seen, you feel heard, and you feel valued.
Consider the people who you have a give and take with, that there's no judgment. And do the same. Do those same people who help you feel seen, heard, and valued, and who don't judge you, find strength from being with you and you with them? Is there a give and take is what we're talking about.
Yeah. And what you just described, Tim, that's the heart of true connection. And if we're really honest, there's probably just a few people who we really have that sort of connection with in real life.
I would agree with that. But as we're talking about cultivating connection with Jesus, congregation, and community, it takes some work. And it's not only work, but it takes time, and you have to be intentional about it.
Yeah, so at the heart of wholehearted discipleship, I would say, is integrity. And if you've heard any of our previous episodes where we talk about our values, you now know why I really wanted to talk about wholehearted discipleship. What I mean by integrity in this sense is integration. Wholeheartedness necessitates integration. It calls your thinking, your feeling, and your behavior all together. It means that all the roles you play make you you. So, Tim, you're not a spouse 1 minute and a father the next and a grandfather the next and a pastor in the fourth moment. All of those things come together to make you who you are. And yes, you may be, if I can use this analogy, wearing different hats at different times because of the people that you're in relationship with. But if you show up in each one of those relationships and are a completely different person, there's not integrity there. So here's your final Latin lesson. You didn't know you were listening to this podcast to get 3 Latin lessons for the day. There will be a quiz at the end. Just kidding. There really won't. The Latin root of integrate is integrare. It means to make whole. So when I'm talking about integration, when I'm talking about bringing your thoughts, your feelings, and your behavior together, when I'm asking you to think about how do all of your roles that you play in life come together, what I begin to wonder is what would happen if you integrated courage and connection and compassion in your relationship with Jesus, your congregation, and your community, you'd end up having wholehearted disciples. So the question is, where will you begin? Not, are you a wholehearted disciple or not? It's more about, where are you going to begin? As you think about your relationship with Jesus, your congregation, and your community, as you think about where you're at in being a person of courage, the compassion that you have, as well as the connection, what's your first step?
I think what we would suggest, Sarah, is that you don't choose the mountain to climb, the toughest relationship on the page. Start with an easy win. Start with one that's an easy first step, and then return to this podcast and to the one pager that we're offering and take another step.
Yeah, so let me remind you that you can download the one-page transformation guide and explore for yourself how you're doing with courage, compassion, and connection with Christ, your congregation, and local community. And you can even try to say all of those C's together for yourself. And we're going to be here to help you continue taking the next steps. So if you'll just take one step, and Tim and I take one step, and your friends take one step, we're one step closer, folks, to transforming the world.
Sarah, as I have given thought to what we've talked about today, just let me say, I've become more who I am because of the relationships in my life. I've become more of who God has created me to be when I can, as one of the words we've already heard today from the example that you used, when I can step into the arena and live my life wholeheartedly by giving myself to the people around me. So that's really what we're talking about today. You're a wholehearted disciple already. It's just as you step into it, you begin to see more and more of who God created you to be. And so it's not a destination as much as it is a journey.
And it's that constant integration that deepens the relationships and strengthens the relationships that you have. And so it may start, when I think about where I began as an adult in my relationship with Jesus, and I think about others who are at the early stages of really stepping into what that means. It's almost like a loose weave on a blanket. And then over time, there are more threads that get woven and more threads that get woven, and it could actually keep you warm. But that all takes time, and it all takes integration. And so this isn't an episode about beating yourself up. This isn't an episode to say, well, given what they were talking about, no, there's no way I'm a wholehearted disciple. Whether you say yes or no, it's my prayer that you'll say, I'm taking one step to become a wholehearted disciple. So head over to the show notes page at transformingmission.org/104 and download the one-page transformation guide. Then go lead a movement of Jesus followers. Bye for now.